We'll go ahead and get started. This is our third breakout session that we have. The session is restorative practices in the higher education setting. Today we have Matt Disher from NDSU to insights on student retention. He is the Assistant Dean of Students for NDSU, been educated for 20 years, previously in the K-12 public school system, as well as higher ed student affairs. You have previously worked in residence life at NDSU, SCSU, NDSCS, and you earned a bachelor's degree in music education in 2004 and a master's in education for student affairs in 2016, not from NDSU.
My PhD is coming, so starting that January of 25. So.
From NDSU?
Yes.
All right, then.
So I will get back a jackrabbit.
All right, go ahead.
Anyway, it's great to see y'all here today. Welcome. I am Matt Disher, Assistant Dean of Students. I've been here for about a year and a half, and I do a number of different things in my role, but one of the things that is part of my job responsibilities as the Assistant Dean is coordinating our Restorative Practices Network here at NDSU, which is made of a number of volunteers who have agreed to go through training to facilitate restorative practices here on campus. Jessica is here. She's one of our volunteers as well, so she's sort of making sure I don't get anything wrong as we go.
I have no worries.
Really briefly, my goals are to just give a little bit of history, both longer ago and more current, around restorative practices and how they've been used. Talk a little bit about the most common one that we use on our campus, which is talking circles, and then maybe provide some examples how you might start to think about how to use these in your work. So a brief, and I'm going to say just a really brief overview to give everyone sort of a baseline, and I'm skipping a lot here, but I think it's important to acknowledge that restorative practices are being used in a lot of ways in the public school system here on our campus, but they are not new and not really ours either. They come from indigenous, Afro-Indigenous roots. They come from cultures that are really deeply community oriented in how they look at how they live in the world, how they deal with conflicts. And so as conflicts would arise in these cultures, bringing people together to tell their story, to listen deeply, and to talk deeply in a circle in a very egalitarian structure is a deep part of that. And so circle was a big part of that foundation, and really about connection and about restoring relationships. And as we think about how maybe conflict has been dealt with in the legal system or in other spaces, it's a different viewpoint than the traditional exclusionary modes of dealing with harm and conflict. This is a much different way of looking at calling people in rather than excluding people from. So even though it comes from these very historical roots in indigenous cultures, in the modern day, really in the 70s, especially around the Elmira case, which is sort of one of the first instances of victim offender reconciliation programs, it's been adopted as something that provides an opportunity for all stakeholders to be involved in how do we repair relationships, how do we repair harm that exists. And so diversion programs, victim offender reconciliation, and these practices were recognized by the American Bar and the United Nations at different points in time on the criminal side of things. And so that's an important history to exist too. Unfortunately, as these things were starting to be developed, there were other things happening that swung harder towards the traditional ways of dealing with conflict and harm. If we think about DARE and zero tolerance and Columbine and active threat, the pendulum really shifted very hard to exclusionary practices. However, there were a lot of schools, especially local to us in the Minnesota area, that were adapting these restorative justices in their work because they were recognizing the things that were helpful about them and why they are very high leverage, high impact practices when dealing with things. And so Minnesota was one of the front runners in that sort of push to move the pendulum the other direction. And, you know, I think we discovered that zero tolerance just does not work from a research-based thing, and Not only does it not work, it gets overused. Exclusionary issues like suspension, expulsion gets overused. The research shows that it especially gets overused with marginalized populations as well. And so in 2014, the DOJ and DOE put forth a statement actually recommending restorative practices along with a number of other things as a way to deal or to respond to create safe, active, engaged learning environments. And so, you know, in the K-12 system, I was a teacher from 2005 to 2012, 2013. And so I know there are a number of different things in the K-12 sphere, different implementations of the fish philosophy and this style thing. And, you know, restorative justice kind of got lumped in there because there are a lot of commonalities between some of those different philosophies, but it is an important one to point out. And then also in higher education specifically, some schools that started to use restorative practices more. University of Colorado Boulder saw a significant impact as they went to restorative practices. Specifically, a lot of these schools looked at restorative justice as it had to do with student misconduct. That's one of the easiest areas in which to apply it. Again, while our conduct processes are not legalistic or judicial, we call them quasi-judicial because they have some commonalities there. And so a lot of the schools implemented alternative resolution processes where people could take responsibility for what they did, talk to people affected in the community. You know, again, at a college, typically if someone has a loud party one night, they would go talk to an administrator. The administrator would try and help them understand why that's not good to do. And then they would have to do a punishment that we would call an educational sanction, but the student would see as a punishment. The alternative is bringing together that student with the people on the floor to say, this is how you impacted me, and then giving the student the opportunity to say, this is how I've been feeling. I've been feeling excluded, ashamed, embarrassed. And again, it's less about punitive measures and it's more about repairing and restoring those things. One of the biggest schools that are currently using this right now is University of San Diego. They actually have a certification program and a degree in restorative justice. And so that's a great place if this is something interesting to you that you would like to learn more about it. They utilize it both in their actual practices and they have the academic program there. So that's a real brief history of restorative justice and restorative practices from its roots, which we acknowledge to be not ours, all the way to the modern, where we are adapting these practices in ways that can be really high impact and make our classrooms and outside of our classrooms really developmental places for our students to grow and be part of the community. And so I want to take a moment to talk a little bit about what those who study in restorative justice and restorative practices in education specifically see as the core tenets and the core values if you are going to try and implement this. And again, the goal is not that this is checkbox, this is a thing we have on a shelf. It's how do you live these values and how do you create it for the students you work with. And fundamental to all of these things is right in the middle here, the core tenet of restorative justice in education, which says people are worthy and people are relational. And what that means is it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter your identity, backgrounds, experiences, because you are here, you are worthy and you have value. Full stop. And I think that all of us as educators in this room can agree with that. A student who walks into a space should feel like they have value and worth, even when they're exceeding expectations and even when they're not and when they're struggling. It doesn't matter. They have value at every step of the way simply because they are. The other part is relational. And again, this is something that is different than the traditional sort of ways we deal with harm and conflict, is that we can't separate the individual from community and relationships, because that's what humans are. We are relational with each other, and that's an important part of that. And so everything else that we talk about is derived from the fact that people are worthy and relational. And the core values that come along with that when we're talking about restorative justice are respect and mutual concern for others. And so that really leads into the three things that we see in restorative justice and education, which is we nurture healthy relationships, we create just and equitable learning environments, and we repair harm and transform conflict. And being the person who's in charge of sort of a lot of the student misconduct on campus, I like that it talks about how do we repair harm, how do we transform conflict? Because we know we can't avoid conflict here at NDSU, we can't avoid conflict in the classroom K through 12. So rather than how do we keep it from happening, how do we transform it into a positive tool for growth and development, and how do we use it to make things better at the end of it? And so this is really the core as the research and as the academics have really started to get behind restorative justice and education, sort of a grounding theory of how they see it playing out when you're utilized. There are a lot of different ways to get there. There's a lot of writing on the screen. I recognize I wasn't supposed to put this much up here, but I only put this up here to show you the myriad ways that you can approach restorative practices. You can do restorative hearings like I talked about, where there's a conduct officer that addresses misconduct that exists. You can do boards where it's a number of people who represent students or represent a community, even though they weren't the ones that were maybe harmed or impacted or involved, but they represent those who do, and they're trained so that they can do that. You can do conferences. This is used a lot in the justice system where, two teens vandalize a window. Like the Elmira case I talked about, that's where it started. Two teens vandalize, and instead of just giving them, here's your punishment, they brought community members together so that they could have the opportunity to talk about the harm that was done, and the students could have the opportunity to talk with them about, okay, we recognize that this is the harm done, we want to repair this, and then the group comes together to make a decision about where we go from there. And then I'll skip down to restorative dialogue. This is an opportunity where maybe there are mutual responsibilities. They use things like fights or other stuff and mutual impact. And so those are some different options that other schools and other programs may use. We really use exclusively restorative circles or talking circles here on our campus. And so talking circles are, and I'll maybe go back a few slides just to show you here. Talking circles are sort of represented by this idea here where you bring participants together in a circle as equals, regardless of their role on campus or anything else. You bring them together as people, and you give everyone the opportunity to talk about impact and to talk about whatever the subject is. So circles, I brought my circle book here that all of these are different types of circles that you can have, but it's really a versatile tool and a way to have really difficult, meaningful conversations with different people. And it really helps focus in participants and get to the underlying stuff that's going on. So it's a really great tool. And like I said, there are a number of different types of talking circles, but every talking circle really incorporates a lot of the same things. So the first thing is the setup. You make sure that people are sitting in a circle and that there are typically meaningful objects that are in the middle as part of it. At NDSU, we utilize little stuff like bison, flags that have our school song. We have laminated values from the institution about respect, integrity, innovation, whatever's appropriate for the conversation that's happening, we'll put out in the middle just to sort of have. And that's part of the ceremony of the circle. I know all of you, I don't know what you are doing in education, but from my experience, you are doing many things with very little prep time or break time or anything else. So just like students, we ourselves will find ourselves in a meeting or in something else coming straight from another thing. So circles typically have some sort of ceremony at the opening and the closing to mark the space and to separate people from the everyday life to we are here sitting together. And ceremony sounds very stuffy and very formal. It can be as simple as a quote that you want to start the group out with as you go, or it can be as simple as asking for everyone to close your eyes and take a breath or two without talking or anything else and just breathing in, thinking about holding this space as different than the normal life. So it can be simple, but it's a powerful part of doing it. And then circles have a talking piece, which is an object that's passed around the group and only the person who's holding it can speak. And so many people have heard of a talking stick. That is, where it comes from, is that how these conversations would be done is that someone would be holding whatever the talking piece is, and then others around the circle would be deeply listening without thinking about what am I going to say. They'll be making eye contact. They'll not be doing the typical thing of sort of like trying to interject in, which is really hard. Jessica and I will agree. We're so used to having interactive conversations where as someone's talking, we're getting ready to jump in, or there's a pause in what they're saying, and so we leap in to try and help them. It is really powerful to have not only a speaker with undivided attention from the group, but just everyone listening. I love this quote: listening is not a passive activity. It is harder in some ways to listen deeply than it is to talk deeply, because you have to try and put yourself in that person's shoes. You have to stop yourself from trying to center what the conversation is on you. Circles will have a keeper or a facilitator. That's, like I said, Jessica, myself, or any number of the different trained volunteers. They have a number of different roles. They monitor the space. They make sure that participants feel safe to speak openly and honestly. In some circles, they are led by the facilitators or keepers, and so those people will come with questions or prompts to give to the group. Other circles will have the facilitators or keepers lead a discussion at the beginning about what the participants want to talk about. So some circles don't even have a set agenda when you come, other than just, we're going to sit in circle today. In the K through 12 space, it's become a lot more regular in elementary school and other places. Beginning of the week, there's not a reason to have a circle other than, hey, we're starting our week out in circle and giving students an opportunity to do that. And then in circles that are a little more broad, maybe there aren't ground rules that the facilitator comes in sharing with people. There's the expectation that the group creates those expectations together. Again, it is about all of us together agreeing and sitting in community, not one person enforcing rules that's on there. The facilitator or the keeper is there to make sure that once rules are agreed upon, everyone's sort of following them, and we'll kind of guide discussion back in those ways. But along with that, in our last point about consensus decision making, it's up to everyone to be an active part of not only listening and speaking, but also as agreements are made, as ground rules are set, everyone has a role to play in that. And like I said, there are a number of different types of circles that really can exist. And so obviously started by saying that using restorative practices started as a diversion program, which is living in this repairing relationships thing. But we utilize circles in a number of ways. The most basic circle is sort of building community. So how are we strengthening and building relationships together? So on the first day of school, in the first 2 weeks of classes, doing an intro circle where students can learn about and they can grow. Are we doing it during welcome week? Or RAs doing it on their floor to get people connected? There are all of these ways that you can utilize circles before something happens, just to set up a space. And again, being a K through 12 teacher, in my experience, it was always, it's better for the group to create the rules together than come in on day one. And it's again, how a lot of those high impact, high leverage things look similar because they are high impact and they help students engage. Obviously, there's building community, but there's also what happens when there's conflict or harm that happens. And so that's that example of how are we doing a community concern circle. So, something happens and the students or the person who may have either purposely or accidentally caused harm. Bringing the community together to give everyone a chance to talk about how it's impacted them. And if we know the person or people who may have accidentally or purposely instigated that harm, giving them the opportunity to talk about their experience as well. And again, trying to repair those relationships. They may not be perfect after you're done, but at least they are going the right direction. And more importantly, as we know working with students, you've given them a safe space for them to actually talk instead of writing snippy things on whiteboards or notes or texts or anything else. Like, this is creating a healthy avenue to express how they are feeling and how a relationship can be repaired. And then, there are some times where it is appropriate to separate someone from a community. In NDSU, that might be academic suspension. That might be a conduct thing. In a school, it might be a suspension or expulsion or things like that. It might be not being able to be part of a student employment opportunity because that student made choices and just can't do it anymore. But again, how do we move from exclusionary, okay, you are banished to the outworld, right? Now it's, how do we reintegrate you back into the community? So we're actually working on how you can do some of these things. So when someone comes back to NDSU from an academic suspension, what does that look like? Well, right now, as far as I understand, it looks like get registered for classes and come on back, right? But how are we supporting the students? What if instead of just being like, here are your classes, welcome back after 3 semesters, we said, hey, let's sit down with a circle. Who are some of the people on campus that you're going to need support and accountability from? And bring them together in a group, like maybe their advisor, maybe someone from the Center for Accessibility and Disability Services, maybe someone from the counseling, maybe their mentor on campus, maybe some of their friends, and say, welcome back, Matt. What do you want to talk about? What support, what things do you need? Wouldn't that be transformative to do? That's what we're trying to move to in a lot of these things. And so the other aspect of this is there are different types of circles based on what you're trying to do, community, harm repair, or reintegration. There are also different types of circles in terms of, are you being proactive? Are you doing this before something comes up or there's harm or conflict? Like I said, welcome week, core values, stress around the holidays. There's a guest speaker coming, it's coming out week. And so you're developing an opportunity to have people talk about their experiences. Or are you responding to something that took place and giving the community and giving its members an opportunity to share their experience? And so both of these can be really great. My recommendation and what we are trying to do is you can't wait to do restorative practices until someone scratches something nasty into a bathroom stall. Because at the point that some harm happens and you start to talk to people about, here's an option for you, they don't know what it is, it's mystified, it's just not a good option that exists. And so you want to integrate restorative practices into everything that you do. So if this is interesting to you, just some quick things as we wrap up. We would love if you'd be willing to participate and encourage others to know more about circles. Come to a talking circle. We post our talking circles on My NDSU. Request a talking circle. You can email us or fill out a form on our website to request a talking circle, and we will get on the phone with you or meet you and see if it's appropriate for your situation. Or just let us know if you have any questions. And if you're really jazzed about this and you're going, okay, I could see myself getting even more involved. We're always looking for more volunteers to get trained as circle keepers. And we have a meeting every month where we come together to discuss ideas where we can utilize circles to help students, faculty, and staff, and just continue to learn in the process. So again, there are a number of different resources that exist out there. I have a bunch of them. They can be borrowed from me as well, but I want to leave any time that you have for any questions. Yes.
Stephanie Bruggeman, I'm from Augustana. So we use projects in several of our classes and our labs. And without fail, we have one or two dysfunctional groups every semester in each class. Would the talking circles be?
I mean, certainly, depending on what your curriculum and what your time aspect looks like, you could be thinking about before you start on the very first day of a project, bringing everyone together. And again, it's tough because you would need facilitators for those small groups. I would see that as sort of, again, at that point, we can either do it proactively by starting by, hey, how do we build and strengthen the relationship on the team? So like day one of the project is, here's the project, and your assignment for this class period is to sit in circle, to take turns talking about, what are you excited about for this project? What are you anxious about or worried about this assignment? You know, and what strengths do you bring to group work, and have them actually do some metacognition about group work in and of itself. And then if you do or don't do that, if problems arise, then again, it's your opportunity to do potentially a circle where you bring people together, and then you can give them turns one at a time using the talking piece to talk about how they've experienced their work in the group, with the hope that others are listening before waiting to get in there and tell them why the other people around the circle stink. And if they can have that transformative conversation about this is what someone else is feeling and really deeply hear it, and everyone gets that opportunity, and then you circle back around to, okay, now it's time to come up with some consensus decision making. So not everyone has to be enthusiastic, but we need to live with whatever we agree to in there. And the tricky thing, and Jessica, I think will agree, circles take time. And I think that is one thing that as we acknowledge the roots of circle and restorative justice, you know, I can hear factory whistles sometimes in a very sort of class periods and dealing with conflict and harm and everything else. It takes time to sit down and have these deep conversations. And so I think it could be a useful tool in one of those ways or both of them, but I obviously don't want to say go do it because I haven't done it in that way before. But I think it's a cool idea, and I think Jessica and I will actually bring that back to our next meeting to say, here's an opportunity how we can market it to people on our campus of like, hey, are you having a group project that's really struggling? We have a circle keeper. We'll come in for an hour and a half outside of the classroom, and we'll facilitate a conversation with everyone.
I had a couple of thoughts just about a particular question. One of the main things with restorative circles, or if you're addressing a problem, is that everyone has to be on board to participate in circle. That's an important part of the circle process. So if there's people in the group that refuse to do circle, then it's not going to be an appropriate solution.
Yeah.
But the benefit, if everyone is on board, is what typically happens in my experience with a group gone bad. Is the professor, somebody jumps in and says, hey, I need you to step it up. You're not doing your job. I'm hearing that other people are carrying all the weight here, which then creates this wave of shame for that student.
Yes.
Well, now my whole group hates me. So the natural response to that is to not go back, to exacerbate the problem. So if there's a conversation, no, we want you here, we want you to participate. And he's there or she is there hearing, and everyone wants me here, it takes away that fear of returning by really opening. So I think it could be a really good tool, but just that caution of making sure everyone is on board before putting it together.
Yeah, and I think that's a really good point as we close out, is that all restorative practices have to be opt-in, even in a criminal justice, even in student conduct. It doesn't work if you sort of have a stick over someone's head and you're like, participate in this fun alternative thing or else, because you're not going to get that buy-in. Another place that we use it that's not intuitive is in our Title IX office. you know, it is an option to use as part of informal resolution to sexual misconduct, discrimination and harassment that exists at the student level too, because again, if both people come together and they have the opportunity to talk about what things have impacted them and what they want moving forward, can agree upon something together, that's ultimately going to be better than an official from NDSU imposing something upon them. I want to make sure I get to your question.
I'm curious, do these sort of circles can we work in person?
No, that's a really great question. And it's something we've talked about too, because we partner, we're lucky to have someone here in town who's part of one of the many restorative justice national groups, the NAJRC. And he facilitated virtual circles throughout the pandemic. He facilitated them for larger national things that happen. You know, I think it's important to note that while we try and be as inclusive as we can be here, we recognize that it might be more comfortable for a student with a marginalized identity that doesn't see a lot of people here on campus with that same identity to maybe participate in a virtual circle with people from around the country who look like them, come from that identity, because that can feel like a safer space. There are obviously limitations and alterations that you would need to do in a space where you did it, but it can work online. Yeah, so typically what you would do is you would work out an order that existed, you know, you'd have potentially breakout rooms where you would do smaller conversations, it would be easier, but no, that's a great question.
Very much.